Okay, so get this. Global shipping. You know, the absolute lifeblood of world trade. It's kind of hit a wall.
A big one, it sounds like.
Yeah. Container bookings have just plummeted. We're talking 60% down.
60%. Wow. That's massive.
Right. And your first thought is probably, okay, war, another pandemic wave,
Sure.
some, huge natural disaster.
It's usually what causes disruptions on that scale, yeah.
Nope. What analysts are pointing to is, well, maybe less dramatic on the surface, but the consequences could be huge.
Yeah.
U.S. trade policies, specifically tariffs.
It's pretty striking, isn't it, that the disruption seems to be coming from inside the system rather than like an external shock. You just don't usually see these kinds of really sharp drops in global shipping unless there's a clear global crisis going on. So the fact that policy decisions are being flagged like this, it really underlines how much leverage they can have on the whole world economy.
Totally. So this is the deep dive. And our mission today really is to unpack the economic sort of wreckage these tariffs might be causing and what the potential fallout could be for all of us.
Okay.
So just a quick primer for everyone listening. Tariffs, they're basically taxes, right? Slapped on goods coming into the country.
Import taxes.
And the initial idea, or at least the stated idea, was to give American industries a bit of an edge, maybe fix some trade imbalances, especially, with China.
Kind of like trying to make your local apples look cheaper by making imported oranges cost more?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And if you look at the sort of the thinking behind it, tariffs often come from this desire for economic protectionism, they call it.
Right.
It's really about trying to shield your own industries at home from competition from overseas. And the reasons can vary, maybe keeping jobs at home or even national security worries, like maybe not wanting to depend too much on other countries for really critical supplies.
Right. And this whole thing really kicked into high gear back in 2018 under President Trump.
That was the big shift.
Yeah, suddenly a massive range of stuff coming from China, electronics, machines, just everyday consumer goods got hit with these tariffs. Some went up to, 25%?
High as that, yeah. And it wasn't just China. We also saw tariffs put on steel, aluminum, other materials from lots of different countries.
So what was the core argument then? Why do this so broadly?
Well, looking at the analysis, the reasoning was kind of layered. Part of it was about creating an incentive, encouraging American companies to make stuff here domestically.
Protect American jobs.
Protect American jobs, exactly. Reduce our reliance on countries like China. And also address those national security risks tied to maybe supply chains that feel vulnerable, especially for things like semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, stuff deemed critical.
Okay, so those were the goals, the intentions.
Yeah.
But what happened immediately when these tariffs actually went live? What were the first shockwaves?
The most immediate hit was right in the supply chain. You had American manufacturers, ones who really depend on parts and raw materials from overseas. They suddenly faced much higher costs. Like imagine you're a car factory needing steel or an electronics company needing those microchips. The price for those essential bits just jumped almost overnight because of the tariffs.
And these higher costs, they didn't just disappear into thin air, did they? Businesses had a choice to make.
Precisely. Retailers who import tons of different products, they were suddenly in a tough spot. They could, eat those higher costs themselves, which means smaller profits.
Yeah.
Or they pass them on to us, the consumers. And, well, not surprisingly, the data shows most of them chose to raise prices on the shelves.
So how much extra did this actually cost the average person? Do we have a number on that?
Yeah, the National Bureau of Economic Research, they looked into this. They estimated that those tariffs just from 2018 to 2019 added about $40 billion a year to the prices Americans paid.
$40 billion. Wow.
Yeah. And to make that more real for the average American household, that translated to roughly an extra $300 to $400 in expenses each year, purely because of these tariffs.
That's definitely noticeable for a lot of families.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, now let's jump back to that really alarming number you mentioned, the 60% drop in container bookings Flexport's CEO talked about. That sounds way beyond just a minor blip.
What's so significant about that 60% figure is, well, first, just how huge it is, but also the cause being cited.
Right, the policy link.
Exactly. A drop that big signals a massive slowdown, a contraction in goods moving around the world. And because it's being tied directly to U.S. trade policy, not some, external crisis, it suggests there's a fundamental blockage happening in the gears of global trade.
So what does that 60% drop actually mean on the ground? What are the domino effects we'd expect to see?
Okay, think of it like this. Businesses suddenly stop ordering imported goods, maybe because they just gotten too expensive with the tariffs.
Okay.
So the demand for ships to carry those goods just vanishes, which means you get cargo ships literally sitting idle in ports. They can't find cargo.
Empty
Empty ships. Then warehouses start overflowing with stuff that isn't selling because retailers are thinking twice about stocking up on items that cost them more due to tariffs.
Got it.
And then ultimately, the ports themselves, the hubs of all this activity, they see less traffic, which can mean fewer hours, maybe even layoffs for the dock workers, the truck drivers, everyone involved.
That paints a pretty grim picture, and the analysis really drives home that this is tied to the tariffs, right? It even compares it to the supply chain mess during the pandemic.
It does, but it highlights a really crucial difference.
Which is?
The supply chain problems during COVID, they were mostly because of unexpected external things, factories suddenly shutting down, huge, weird surges in demand for certain things.
Right. Toilet paper, semiconductors.
Exactly. This current situation, though, the analysis frames it as self-inflicted. The tariffs are the main reason imports are getting so pricey, essentially building an artificial wall that's blocking the flow of goods.
So this isn't just a temporary hiccup. It sounds like it could actually spiral.
Well, the analysis warns about the risk of a vicious cycle. You get lower demand, so businesses cut back on production, which flows down the economy even more. And that can lead to a broader economic contraction, where companies just get nervous about investing or hiring because everything looks so uncertain.
And the potential economic damage number being thrown around is, frankly, it's eye-watering. $2 trillion if these tariff policies just stay as they are.
Yeah, it's a huge number.
What does that $2 trillion actually mean for, you and me, for our daily lives?
So that figure, it represents the estimated total hit across the whole economy. It's trying to capture everything, potential business closures, the millions of jobs that could be lost because of that,
Okay.
and the big drop in overall consumer spending that happens when people just have less money to spend.
It sounds like smaller businesses would be particularly vulnerable in that kind of environment.
Oh, absolutely. Small and medium-sized businesses, they often run on much thinner profit margins. Right? They don't have the deep pockets or the huge networks that big corporations do to just absorb higher costs or quickly pivot to find brand new suppliers somewhere else. So yeah, they're much more likely to go under when their costs keep rising and customers stop buying as much.
And what about jobs? I mean, wasn't a key argument for tariffs supposed to be protecting American jobs?
It's a really stark irony, isn't it? The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, their estimate suggests millions of jobs could actually be lost because of these tariffs.
Millions.
Yeah, particularly in sectors like manufacturing, retail, logistics, some of the very areas tariffs were supposed to help. It means real people could lose their jobs because of policies originally meant to support them.
And even for people who keep their jobs, it sounds like their money just won't stretch as far.
The analysis suggests we're likely looking at continued price increases for essential stuff. If supply chains stay gummed up and import costs stay high because of tariffs, we can probably expect to pay more for things like food, clothes, electronics, the basics.
Which hits some harder than others.
Absolutely. It disproportionately impacts lower and middle income families. They might be forced into making really tough choices about what they can actually afford. And that puts more strain on social safety nets, potentially making economic inequality even worse.
We've been talking about rising prices generally, and it really feels like tariffs are just pouring fuel on that fire of inflation we're already dealing with.
That's a good way to put it. Tariffs definitely act as an inflationary pressure, and they do it in a few ways.
Okay, how?
Well, first and most obviously, they directly make imported goods more expensive. And like we said, those higher costs usually get passed right on to consumers.
Right.
Our analysis points to goods that are subject to tariffs, seeing price hikes of as much as 20% in some cases.
20%? Wow, that's huge.
It is. And it's not just, a few random products.
Yeah.
The cost of a typical grocery run is reported to have gone up quite a bit since 2018. Same for clothes, household goods.
Okay, so that's the direct cost increase. What else?
Second, tariffs create those supply chain bottlenecks we talked about. When goods become harder to get, less available, their prices tend to go up too. Basic supply and demand.
Makes sense.
And third, you have the retaliatory tariffs. When other countries hit back and put tariffs on American exports, that hurts U.S. businesses. And it can also limit the supply of certain goods globally, which, again, adds more fuel to the inflation fire.
So it's really hitting our wallets from all sides then.
It seems that way.
Beyond just the raw data and the percentages, the analysis really tries to bring home the human cost of all this. It paints some pretty tough pictures.
Yeah, and it's so important to remember that. These aren't just abstract numbers on a page. They represent real people's lives being significantly affected.
Right.
Think about a small business owner. Maybe they built something up for years, and now they might have to close down, lay off employees who depend on those jobs. Or, picture a factory worker, maybe somewhere in the Midwest. They could be facing fewer hours, or even losing their job entirely because the company just can't afford the raw materials anymore with the tariffs tacked on.
Or even just going to the grocery store.
Exactly. Or think about a single parent just trying to buy the basics for their kids, and suddenly prices are way up, maybe some shelves are even empty again.
It's not just theory then, it's actually happening.
That's what the analysis stresses. These are the lived experiences, as they put it, for millions of Americans. The consequences are being felt right now in homes and communities all over the country.
The analysis is pretty blunt about it too, isn't it? It uses phrases like failure of leadership. It suggests maybe there was a real misunderstanding of how complex global trade actually is.
That's a really critical point that comes through. The analysis implies maybe an underappreciation for just how tangled and interconnected global supply chains really are.
And maybe too much optimism about how fast U.S. industries could just adapt.
Yeah, perhaps an overestimation of how quickly American companies could adjust to a sudden big jump in the cost of imported stuff they rely on. There's definitely a suggestion that warnings from economists, from business leaders, trade experts like Flexport's CEO maybe weren't taken seriously enough.
And even though the stated goal was something like economic sovereignty,
Right.
the actual results seem to be pushing us maybe further away from economic stability.
That's the central tension highlighted. The idea of economic sovereignty, a country being more self-reliant, less dependent on foreign suppliers, it has its appeal, sure.
Of course.
But the analysis makes a strong case that the method chosen these widespread tariffs has ended up triggering really significant negative outcomes, ones that seem to outweigh potential gains towards that sovereignty goal.
And it wasn't like the U.S. was acting in isolation, right? Other countries were always going to react.
Oh, absolutely not. Predictably, our major trading partners, China, Canada, the EU, others, they responded. They hit back with their own retaliatory tariffs, specifically targeting American goods, aimed right at key U.S. industries. Agriculture got hit hard, automakers, even things like American whiskey. It caused real harm to American farmers, manufacturers, distillers, people who depend on selling their products internationally.
So American businesses and workers got caught right in the middle of these trade fights.
Exactly. Caught in the crossfire. And the analysis also touches on the bigger picture, the wider risks for the global trading system itself.
Like what?
Noting warnings from the World Trade Organization, the WTO, about how escalating trade tensions like these can undermine decades of progress in making global trade work, and how it could disproportionately hurt developing nations, the ones that often rely most heavily on global commerce to grow their economies.
Okay, so if this is the situation, what's the way out? What does the analysis suggest needs to change to, fix this?
Well, the most direct solution that comes across, although everyone acknowledges it's politically tricky, is to lift or, at the very least, significantly reduce the tariffs that are causing these problems.
Just get rid of them.
That's presented as the core step. But the analysis also really emphasizes that shouldn't be the only step. It needs to be part of a much bigger, more comprehensive long-term strategy.
Okay, so beyond just rolling back the tariffs, what else is needed? What other pieces does the analysis point to?
It highlights several key things. First, there needs to be real, sustained investment in strengthening American industry itself. Things like better workforce training, more money for R&D, fixing up our infrastructure.
Makes sense.
The CHIPS Act, the one aimed at boosting semiconductor production here, that's mentioned as like a positive example of that kind of investment.
Okay, what else?
Second, big efforts are needed to build supply chains that are more resilient. That means diversification, not relying too much on one source. It means maybe forging new trade agreements with allies, say, in Asia, Europe, Latin America, and providing real incentives for companies to bring production back to the U.S., or at least closer, nearshoring, they call it.
Right, resilience and diversification.
Now,
got it.
Third, tackling inflation requires a coordinated effort between the Federal Reserve, Congress, maybe looking at things like boosting domestic energy production, streamlining regulations where it makes sense to cut business costs.
So monetary policy and fiscal policy working together.
Exactly. And finally, re-engaging. Talking constructively with our trading partners again, including China, using those multilateral frameworks like the WTO to actually tackle the tough issues like intellectual property theft or unfair subsidies, but doing it through dialogue, not just tariffs.
So it's definitely not just a simple flick of a switch, removing the tariffs. It's about a much more strategic, multi-pronged approach to building an economy that's actually strong and competitive.
Precisely. Lifting the tariffs is framed as like the critical first move to stop the bleeding, so to speak. But it really needs to be followed up with these broader investments and diplomatic efforts to fix the underlying issues and build a more robust, more sustainable American economy for the long haul.
We've definitely covered a huge amount of ground today, and it seems pretty clear these tariffs have had some really significant and maybe largely unintended consequences for the whole global economy and definitely for us here at home.
Yeah, what really stands out is that stark contrast, isn't it, between the original goals behind the tariffs and the very real and worrying results we're seeing now, especially that huge drop in container bookings that's such a concrete sign that something is seriously wrong.
A real red flag.
A massive one. And the analysis paints this sobering picture, a potential $2 trillion hit to the economy, the risk of shortages that feel like the pandemic all over again.
And ultimately, like you said, it all comes back to how it affects real people. Businesses just trying to keep the lights on, workers worried about their jobs, families struggling with prices going up and just trying to make ends meet.
Which maybe leaves us all with a really important question to chew on, right? If tariffs aren't the answer, what does a truly strong, adaptable, globally connected American economy actually look like? Maybe that's the next deep dive we all need to consider.